kind of starting with album 0. Their first full-length independent release. A lot of the tracks were repeated on the next album. This was only widely released last year. I think it's cool from an archaeological standpoint, but it's not really what I come to the Tea Party for. It's more traditional rock and roll, lacking for lyrical insight and originality at this point, and the musical dexterity of the Tea Party isn't yet fully on show. So don't start there. Because then there's a major label debut album that re-records several of those tracks. In each one, the unique tracks are worthwhile, just not quite plentiful enough. This feels more albumy, more produced, a bit more mature. The tracks do skew very long, and they don't all hold my attention. It's still within a blues rock tradition, but some of their more unique elements are shining through now. The Tea Party are mainly recognized for their incorporation of what I'm gonna have to just call Eastern music into rock and roll. I don't know which specific part of the East.
What even is the East? You can find it in the West if you go far enough.
It's kind of just an open invitation for anything that sounds good. But yeah, with the baggy durations and the lack of lyrical prowess at this point, I prefer their later work. Such as this. Not much later, but so much more honed. They've found things to sing about, a kind of vague mysticism that I don't share in, but I can still respect musically. They've filled out their sound, and this is just a relentlessly great album, both menacing and delicate, with interesting time signatures and some very impressive musicianship. Now the party's really started. A little extra disc here with some acoustic versions, alternative instrumentation, one unique song. It's all good to great, and this is only negligible because of its brevity. Since the material's all from the era when I consider the party to have really got their shit together, it's going here. And then 1997, hence, a full-on industrial album. These guys are good at jumping to a new sound, and they've completely immersed in this one. It's a dank abyss that expresses the strengths I've already described just within this smaller sound. I mean, a pummeling sound, but less for range of sound. This could easily be a band's best album if the band always sound like this. In this case, it doesn't get to go there because it doesn't have the range of their other works, but it does have the brilliance. I'm going to mention another little EP now.
I think the concept of this one eliminates it from my format because they're just playing a few trance songs 20 years later with the intent of them sounding like the original. So, great, but don't bother.
And then an unforgivable album title, and it's the party playing with everything in their paint box. It's the sound of the last two albums with a bit more like power balladry, just seeing what they can do with the studio. Though this is still the sound of the band at the continuing top of their game, they've not presented the best set here. There's a lot of value one by one, but just as a total, it's not completely compelling. So despite their excellence still being in full view, it's just a bit more Tea Party. This edition has a second disc with various alternative versions and some brand new tracks. Honestly, if that disc had its own name, it would rank pretty well.
But it doesn't.
Then they get weird with it and unsettling. This is their most explicitly alternative rock product. Not done to fit in, but to not fit in. And they're bringing their virtuoso power trio power to the forefront. So that just means it's got a great vibe throughout and the songs to justify it. Then we're in a very Foo Fighters era of rock, and I understand the fans and the band find this one a bit embarrassing. I think it doesn't match up to the Tea Party standard, and indeed this led to them breaking up. I don't know if it's the privilege of ignorance of just not having that context personally, but I don't hear it. I hear them still serving at their best standard. Track 1 answers the mystery everyone was trying to figure out in 2005, which was, what would it sound like if Chris Cornell sang for Rage Against the Machine? I really don't see the alleged weaknesses of this. In a lot of contexts, I can call this my favourite. I feel it's a bit overcompressed in a loudness war way, and he didn't bring his lyrical A-game in every case. but I just don't share the embarrassment of making something that's radio-worthy. The subversion of everything that they're really good at, but in a way that might reach out to more people. I'm not covering things they made when they were broken up. There is enough to include, well, it's enough to include in a separate video if I wanted. I'm just not yet familiar with that stuff, and general consensus is that it's not that important. Whatever, the Tea Party are back, and still showing an exhilarating creative range within hard rock music. This one kind of feels the most prog. They've always had long-ish songs, but this just has that proggy overall vibe to it, and that's a very welcome adjustment to their sound. It shows that even in Reformation, they are about innovating, not just delivering what's familiar. Then quite a bit later, I mean, I understand, they now live continents apart, but they can still collaborate and they can still deliver. Though that makes me question why they didn't really bother delivering for this one. So this is the European release that makes it kind of album length. I understand in other places this was released as a couple of EPs and then a few extra tracks. It's very back to roots rock and roll, but that also means it's the Tea Party presenting themselves without the elements that make them interesting. It still shows their decades of proficiency, and there's pretty moments and some good funk and roll to it, but just kind of familiar standard tuning riffing. If they'd wholeheartedly, whole with a W, intended this as an album, then I think it would be quite legit for me to register my relative disappointment. Since it exists in this kind of between state of definitions, it's more justifiable. And it's good to hear them still making music. They've just somewhat intentionally, by dialing it back to blues rock, made it less good.
I think this one being on top might elicit disagreement, but it's true to me. I'm not saying it's their masterpiece, I'm saying these 5 are their masterpieces.
Yeah.